Okay, so I know it's been a while since I've updated this project. There's a good reason for that, which is that I had to do a little bit of preparation for this part. Because in this part, we're going to go into depth, well, sort of into depth, into Kant's epistemology, and we're going to relate that to Lacan. We're going to relate that to Heidegger. We're going to relate that to Descartes, and we're going to relate that to Marx. Well, Hegel and Marx kind of combined, because Hegel and Marx, as they relate to Kant, they have a very similar relationship, in my view. I could be wrong. I'm still not an expert on Marx or Hegel, for that matter, which is why I call my channel The Uneducated Communist, is because I'm having to reread Hegel and particularly Marx from scratch. It's just that in this particular project, I happen to have a pretty broad philosophical background, which is why it's more of a teaching role rather than a learning role. In any case, let's get into it. Now, for Kant, there are things in themselves, and then there are things as we experience them, right? Or things as they appear to us, right? So the thing in itself, that's noumena, right? And then the thing as we experience it is phenomena, right? So if you see an apple, you see that it's red, you see that it has a particular shape, you recognize it as an apple, it looks like other apples that you've seen, right? But that doesn't mean that you're experiencing the actual source of the object. So like there could be other dimensions to it that you're not perceiving. The color itself is actually the pigment that's not there, not the pigment that is there. That's why it's reflecting it, so on and so forth. So this is kind of a depiction of what I was talking about. So here's your sense perception, and your sense perception can pierce through the phenomena, right? So you can experience the phenomenal, but it's stopped from piercing the noumena. You can't directly know the thing in itself. You can only know how you experience the thing. And you can try to, draw conclusions about the thing in itself based on the way you experience it and based on how it's experienced in different contexts. But then you are only knowing things about the noumena indirectly. You don't directly perceive the noumena, you perceive the phenomena, right? Just like the color red of the apple. The apple is red because it's reflecting back light on that spectrum. So it's actually every color except that color, right? And you can't know that directly, right? You can only experience the red color directly, just as an example. Okay. So the way we go from phenomena, that glare back there, I'm trying to position myself to where I'm in front of it. There we go. All right, if I sit right here, it'll stop. Okay. So the way we go from sense perception to having concepts is through, or not even concepts, to experiencing things as objects, right? Not even concepts yet, but just experiencing things, is through a transcendental aesthetic, right? And I'm just going to go over this very briefly. This, I really should go into this in more depth if you really want to understand Kant. But for now, we're just going to do it like kind of surface level. So a priori, right? That's what you know, what you can know, or what you innately know outside of experience, right? So that's things like internal logical principles. That's unprocessed sense perception, right? Then through a transcendental aesthetic, where you actually start transforming sense data into something comprehensible. You then get a posteriori sort of concepts or shapes of the world, right? So you have the a priori logical faculty, plus your sense perception, plus pre-conscious processing, and ultimately you get conceptual understanding. But that's an entire process, and he gets into that. In his book Critique of Pure Reason, and I was looking for an explanation of the mechanics of that online. I couldn't find it, and it's been long enough since I've actually read that book that I can't just reproduce it offhand. I took notes on it when I took a course on Kant in college, and I need to find those notes because those notes were highly useful. I actually mapped it out, and I'd love to clean up the map that I did of the transcendental aesthetic conceptual conceptual process, where he actually describes how it goes from raw sense data, which he calls the manifold of experience, all the way through to conceptual understanding. Like there's a whole process that goes on pre-consciously that develops that, and he describes it in a very detailed way. And in my view, it is his greatest contribution to the field of philosophy is his description of that process, because it influenced Freud. It influenced, I'm sure, Lacan. Well, at least indirectly, it influenced Lacan through Freud. So it's deeply important. I need to dig up my notes and take another look at them. Couldn't find it online. All right. So here's another image of the transcendental aesthetic. So part of the idea is that in order to transform raw sense data into anything that's sensible to us, we have to have a priori concepts of space and time, right? So here you have raw sense perception, and then you have this a priori concept of space and this a priori concept of time, and those two things together, given raw sense perception, then gives us these ideas about reality that are more concrete, right? And this relates back to Heidegger, because Heidegger describes how, in What is Metaphysics, how from the void, basically, we draw out objects of experience, right? And so Kant and Heidegger are really saying the same thing, but Kant is approaching it from a more technical perspective, and Heidegger is approaching it from a more, I guess you could say, spiritual perspective. But they're basically saying more or less the same thing, where you get this raw sense data, and then you have this sort of a priori concept of space and time, and then you get these sensible objects. And what Kant is saying when he's talking about the phenomena noumena is really space and time are just a perspective on the thing in itself. So that's why we only get a perspective on what we're experiencing. We don't experience the thing in itself directly, right? That's what he's talking about. Our experiences of space-time relates to phenomena, not noumena. I just made that point, and that's to highlight that. Here's another image that kind of describes what we're talking about. So here, this is my poor drawing of an eye, right? So the eye sees this vague, physical object, you could say, and then through a process of sensibility, which is that process of taking raw sense data and processing it, we then get this idea of this much more clear and distinct shape, right? And in a way, this kind of relates to Plato's forms, right? Because Plato had this idea of, oh, well, there's the form of something, right? And then there's the instance of it, right? So in his idea is like we have this mental image of what it is. You could almost think of that as like a Platonic form. And that's how we interpret the things we encounter in real life, right? Let's go over Kant and Lacan. So according to Lacan, when we're born, right, we have a unified preconscious self. So we're just processing data and we're beginning to associate meaning with the things that we experience. It doesn't happen right away, but it happens over time. As we experience things, we start attaching meaning to certain phenomena. We start associating things. And in fact, there's a kind of syntax about this where we have this internal network of meaning that's based on associations of raw sense data. So you hear your mother's voice and you associate it with your mother, right? You smell fresh bread and you associate it with, home maybe. You hear cars out in the street or you hear cars driving and you associate with being outside. So you're taking this raw sense data and you're beginning to associate that with things that have some form of meaning. And that's the unified preconscious self does this, right? At a certain point, we go through what Lacan called the mirror stage, and this is when the ego is formed and the conscious self is formed. This happens simultaneously because the ego and the conscious self are intertwined; like you can't separate them. But around, he made the point that around 18 weeks, what mothers would do is they'd hold their child up to a mirror and say, "Hey, look, that's you," and the child would learn to recognize his mom. And so then by looking in the mirror, he recognized the thing that's not his mom as him. And so then he becomes aware of himself as a distinct entity, right? Once that happens, that causes the ego to form. Once the ego forms, the conscious self begins to form. When the conscious ego begins to form, you become alienated from yourself because you start developing conscious thoughts based on the mother tongue, based on language, because around this same time you're learning to speak, right? So when you use language, that alienates you, right, from your original syntax of sense perception being attached to meaning. So you still experience that, but that's one part of you, right? It's one part of you, but then the conscious part of you is experiencing life through language and through concepts. So when Heidegger talks about this, he talks about language being the house of being. We sense, right, what's happening in the unconscious self with that internal syntax, but we don't have like a conceptual understanding of it. So what Freud talks about is he talks about excavating the unconscious, where things rise to the preconscious, and then from there we have access to them, right? Where they're not immediately conscious, but the consciousness has access to them. So then we lift those up into consciousness. We create language to describe this. And once we've done that, it comes into being in our conscious experience. So when Heidegger talks about language being the house of being, that's what he's referring to, right? So this idea of the split subject, when you're able to gap the split between the subject and your conscious self, and in whatever limited way you can do that, that's utilizing language as the house of being, right? And the way this works with Immanuel Kant, when Immanuel Kant, so the raw sense data that we're confronted with our senses, he calls that the manifold of experience. So that's just the undifferentiated sense data that hits our eyes, our ears, our nose, right? And our skin. It's everything that we sense, undifferentiated. And then so that's what hits the unconscious self, right? The unconscious self receives the manifold of experience. And then from there, through the transcendental aesthetic, the conscious self then develops a concrete idea about what it's directly experiencing. So what it's directly experiencing is processed by the unconscious self. The idea about what we're experiencing is a product of the conscious self, right? All right, now let's examine Kant and Heidegger. So here you have the subject and you have the thing in itself, right? Then from there you have the phenomena, right? This is the noumena as it's experienced by the subject, right? That's the phenomena, right? So far, this is all Kant. Now, what Heidegger does is he takes it one step further, and instead of describing this in a static kind of way, which Kant does, he describes it in a dynamic way. That's the difference, right? So here you have the subject, you have other subjects, and all these subjects are experiencing phenomena based on their interactions with things, with the noumena. And so you have this relationship between the noumena and the phenomena, the subject and the phenomena, right? And the relationship of the subject to the noumena changes. And as it changes, you get different sorts of phenomena, and you get evolutions in language. And then when different subjects interact with each other, that enriches this sort of understanding of the phenomena and the noumena, right? So you have this dynamic sort of relationship between the subject and reality, right? And that's what he means by Dasein. That is what Dasein is. On a technical level, that's what Dasein is, right? Now you'll notice this is similar, this dynamic sort of experience of the phenomena and the evolving phenomena based on the interaction with the noumena, based on the changing forms of interaction with the noumena, right? That's dialectical, right? So this is consistent with the Hegelian dialectic, with the idea of the Hegelian dialectic and the materialist dialectic in particular. So now, in his essay, Haas is talking about Kant. He doesn't say it explicitly, but by implication, he's basically implying that Descartes and Kant are coming from the same place. He's not totally wrong, but he's also not. That's also not completely accurate. So we're going to run down like three of the main claims of Descartes, and then sort of the answers to those claims that Kant and Marx have. And what you'll see, I hope, is that actually Kant is a kind of bridge between what Descartes is saying and what Marx is saying, right? Because what Descartes and Marx are saying is different, but it's different perspectives on the same thing. It's not contradictory. It's just a different way of looking at these same questions, right? So, for instance, Descartes says objective reality may not exist at all. That's that radical self-doubt. Kant modifies that. He says objective reality exists, but it's not as it appears to us, right? That's the whole phenomena versus noumena thing. And what Marx is saying is he takes what Kant's saying and makes it more dynamic. He's saying reality has historical properties and phenomena shift over time, right? So the way he frames everything in terms of a class consciousness, right? And this class consciousness has historical properties. And over the course of history, these classes of people, they experience different material conditions. So the phenomena are dynamic, versus for Kant, he described. I'm not saying Kant said it was static, but Kant understands it in a static way, if that makes sense. So here you have Kant modifying Descartes, and then Marx modifying Kant, right? Descartes says, we only know what we can measure, right? Because if you can't measure it, it's not clear and distinct. If it's not clear and distinct, it's not knowledge, right? Kant says we only know how things present themselves to us, not things in themselves. and our concepts of space and time are merely perspectives on the objective world. So what Kant is saying is actually much, much deeper, because he's actually taking it one step farther from Descartes. He's saying that actually even what we can measure is only phenomena. It's not the thing in itself. It's only related to how we experience the thing in itself, not the thing in itself. And then Marx takes it one step further. He says, knowledge is ultimately relational. We get to know things that we get elbows deep into. Mankind has a dynamic relation to noumena, such that phenomena evolve. Again, this is dialectic, right? So it takes Kant's insight and then makes it dialectical, makes it more dynamic. Descartes says, to know something is to have a clear and distinct idea of it, which I kind of covered in the last one. Kant says, to know something is to synthesize a concept about it that is congruent with the manifold of experience, right? So you have this, reality as raw sense perception as it hits you, right? And knowledge is having concepts that are congruent with what you're experiencing. And again, Marx takes it one step further. He says to know something is to have a material relationship to it. So it's this whole idea of, okay, well, you have concepts, they're congruent with what you're experiencing, but not only that, you're having a dynamic relationship between what you're experiencing and what your ideas are, right? You're affecting reality and vice versa. Reality is affecting you and vice versa. So just present that to you to kind of give you a somewhat richer understanding of what Descartes is saying, what Kant is saying, and what Marx is saying. And even people who follow Kant misunderstand Kant. So what he was saying about those Russian philosophers who follow this sort of Kantian Marxism, it might be completely accurate in terms of his interpretation of them, but their interpretation of Kant, who they claim to follow, may not be totally accurate, because Kant is one of the most misunderstood philosophers in history. And we'll pick back up with the essay from there next time.